great to have so many of you joining us for this discussion on Rules Britannia, better regulation for a better Britain. I'm Ruth Porter from Finsbury Glover Herring, formerly of the IEA myself, and this is a topic that is very close to my heart. Why does it matter? It matters, it seems to me, because ultimately we all want individual businesses with integrity and standards that deliver what they say they are going to do. As well as that, we want a system overall that allows businesses to try new things and to grow and innovate and flourish. Tory politicians are forever talking about how they're going to create better and leaner regulation, but when it comes down to it, regulation only ever seems to increase. So we're here today to look at how we make progress on this and to consider whether it requires a fundamental rethink in how we view regulation. So to bring this to life, we've got a brilliant panel. Sarah Boon. Sarah's the Managing Director of Corporate Affairs at UK Finance. She's also previously worked at London Stock Exchange Group, itself a very heavily regulated business. And before that, she's actually worked both for the FCA and the Bank of England, so she knows a lot about regulation from the regulator's perspective as well. We'll also shortly be joined by George Freeman, MP, Conservative Member of Parliament for Mid-Norfolk, and also the Minister for Science, Research and Innovation at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. George recently worked with Sir Ian Duncan-Smith and Theresa Villiers to lead the government's task force on innovation, growth and regulatory reform. So this is an area which he's done a lot of thinking about for a very long time. You'll notice that he's not here right now, that he will be joining us shortly. He's just dashing over from another fringe event. Victoria Hewson, from the IEA herself, Head of Regulatory Affairs. She's a qualified lawyer and practiced for a long time in both technology and financial services law. So she's worked, again, on a practical level. She's also worked at the Legatum Institute as well. So she's also considered this issue from the policy perspective too. And finally, Philip Salter. Philip founded and runs something called the Entrepreneurs Network. He also previously worked at the Adam Smith Institute. The Entrepreneurs Network is all about helping people who are starting up businesses. So Philip's brings a completely different perspective as well in terms of the smaller companies that he represents and works with. So I welcome George. So we will kick off with some opening remarks. I think, Sarah, over to you if you want to go first.
Fantastic, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, excellent. So I just want to start by thanking the IEA for hosting us this afternoon. I think this is a really important topic, but then I would say that because I was a regulator. So for those of you who aren't aware, UK Finance is the collective voice for the banking and finance industry. We represent around 300 members, and that's from your high street banks to innovative fintechs, so the whole gamut. And we act to enhance competitiveness, support customers, and facilitate innovation. So, as a former regulator, I think and feel very confident in saying that our departure, the UK's departure from the EU, provides our financial services sector with a remarkable opportunity to enhance its already world-class regulatory framework, ensuring it continues to implement the highest standards and remains a globally competitive financial sector for years to come. As many of you will know, this isn't just desirable. I think it's essential, as few industries see as fierce rivalry from international counterparts or innovates quite as quickly. Just to touch on that for a second, across the Atlantic, New York is positioning itself as the leading financial services sector. We see in Asia the emerging markets rapidly catching up, and the ambitions of our European neighbours to create onshore financial centres in the bloc at the expense of business in London is becoming increasingly apparent. So as we look to rebuild from coronavirus and build an economy for the future, we need to make sure that we set up our financial services sector with the tools that it needs to maintain its position and enhance its position as an internationally competitive financial centre, whilst acting in the interests of customers and communities in the UK. So I know not everyone here is from financial services, so I'm going to do a little pitch on financial services because it's really difficult to overstate the importance of financial services to the UK economy. So just a few facts and figures. Financial services accounts for almost 7% of the UK's total economic output, which is huge. The sector employs over 1 million people. And they're not just based in the City of London or Canary Wharf. They're in places as diverse as Bournemouth, Belfast, Edinburgh, Swindon. And being based outside of London in those areas really brings benefits for those communities as well. Obviously, financial services is a major contributor to the exchequer, with £1 in every 20 of total tax receipts coming from financial services. And on top of this, the UK is the world's top exporter of financial services, above the United States, above Switzerland, with a financial services trade surplus of £60 billion in 2019. Why does it matter? Well, it's vital. This surplus is vital to the wider economy because it generates jobs across the country, it lowers costs for consumers around the country, and it helps firms in other sectors expand into overseas markets. But if the UK financial services sector is to stand any hope of remaining above or ahead of the chasing pack, then we really do need to take this opportunity now. Government, regulators, along with industry, must take this chance and design rules and frameworks that will allow financial services to flourish. What do you do first? So the first thing I think we need to do is make sure we have the right framework for financial services. So we're very pleased to see that the Treasury is doing a review of the regulatory framework, and this really provides us with a once-in-a-generation chance to review the regulatory framework for financial services to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the regulation. Now, just to be clear, we're not advocating for a regulatory race to the bottom here. As the Chancellor has rightly stated in his vision for the sector, the UK will continue to maintain the highest global standards as we look to shape the industry. But we can and should take this opportunity to fine-tune regulation, to really look at what we've got at the moment and whether it's right, and look at where we can make changes that benefit us and make the UK more competitive. I believe that the standards that govern the sector should rely less on prescriptive rules and be more responsive, allowing regulation to adapt to changing demands, evolving business models, emerging risks. And we've got to really think about international competitiveness and putting that at the core of any changes that we have. At the same time, we think the future framework, slightly where we're going to get takeaway. At the same time, the future framework should be more proportionate, particularly for mid-tier providers who are currently saddled with disproportionately high costs compared to some of their larger competitiveness. So collectively, I'll talk a lot more about some of the changes later, but collectively, this is a real opportunity for us to make the changes now to put us in the right place for the future and make sure that we're competitive for the years to come.
Thanks, Sarah. Great start. And over to Victoria.
Thank you. So the government at present is very focused on regulatory reform. Ruth mentioned the task force that George was part of, which was focused on innovation and regulatory reform post-Brexit. And we've now got an open, or rather the consultation's just closed, on reforming the framework for better regulation. Alongside it, of course, the government has prioritised innovation in its industrial strategy by setting up things like the Regulatory Horizons Council to ensure that the government and regulators themselves are well advised on developments in science and technology that might need to be supported or facilitated with up-to-date regulation. Now, I'm a bit allergic to this sort of centrally planned, managed innovation idea. One great reason to leave the EU was not having to have an industrial policy anymore. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to complain about improvements to cost-benefit analysis and more scrutiny and accountability for regulators, which are all the kinds of things that the consultation proposals are looking at. But it becomes ever clearer to me that however good your framework is, there is no purely technocratic solution to the burden of regulation. We can refine and improve frameworks and toolkits, we can carry out consultations, equip and resource parliamentary committees to carry out their scrutiny role more effectively, we can add competition and innovation to regulators' objectives, bind them to targets for one in, one out, etc., etc., etc. And lots of these things, have been tried for decades now, really. Ultimately, if ministers have made a political commitment to regulate a sector or have vowed to tackle a perceived gap in the law or a harmful practice, they will do it. And experience shows the guardrails in the process will bend to accommodate the call for something to be done. There's a line in the Bayes Better Regulation Framework proposals that the government's consulting on that I think illustrates the problem quite well. It asks for views on a particular change to help with, quote, striking a balance between economic growth and public protection. Now, we supporters of economic freedom and small government know that economic growth and public protection are not in opposition. And any regulatory framework that proceeds from this assumption and the political culture that it comes from is going to take us in the wrong direction. I'm also very worried about the ratchet effect and the entrenchment of safety culture and learned helplessness brought about by our response to the pandemic. Aside from showing how fragile our freedoms are and how these frameworks crumble when an emergency is perceived to demand it, have we now set dangerous precedents for the level of regulation that's deemed acceptable and the threshold conditions to trigger it? In the UK, of course, the situation with the pandemic was exacerbated by the role of our state religion, the National Health Service, which means that public and personal health are highly politicised at the best of times. And now it seems likely that further taxes, bans and regulations will be justified on the basis that they're necessary to protect the NHS, being as that was such a successful slogan, giving cover to all kinds of interventions and really quite draconian regulations over the past year or so. On a slightly more hopeful note, Lord Frost has announced a programme to comprehensively and qualitatively review the body of retained EU law, that is all the regulations and laws that we simply carried over into our national law when we left the EU in 2019. Now, I expect any attempt to actually repeal anything is going to be met with resistance from all the usual suspects, but at least Lord Frost and his department are asking the right questions here. So while improving processes around regulation is always welcome, unless politicians gain the courage to move away from the reflex assumption that something must be done, that every undesired policy outcome is a market failure or an externality demanding intervention, I fear that technocratic reforms will not scratch the surface, and regulation will continue to be a drag on innovation and personal freedom. Now, I do welcome some of the proposals that Bayes put forward and that the Tigger Commission put forward as well, some of which have been incorporated into those proposals. But it's hard to credit the government for efforts on addressing the burdens of regulation when every day seems to bring forward a new intervention, whether it's something as large and terrifying as the online safety bill, the proposals for codes of practice dictating how digital service providers can run their business, or such seemingly innocuous and frankly pointless proposals as the right to request flexible working. Process is important, but we need a qualitative shift back to some good old-fashioned principles like freedom of contract, freedom of association, and a proper understanding of what we mean by market failure if we are really going to make any dent in the extent of the regulatory state.
Thank you, Victoria. Philip, tell us what you're seeing from the entrepreneurs that you're working with.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, Ruth. So does leaving the EU present an opportunity for deregulation? In a word, I think, yes, it does. But there are some caveats to that. So in the short term, for example, our post-Brexit transition is leading to more rather than less bureaucracy with businesses. Most obviously, that's in the need for additional paperwork, export and import declarations and inspections on trade between Great Britain and the EU and Northern Ireland. And just because there are areas where we can diverge from the EU, it might not always be in our best interest to do so. There are costs to moving away from EU standards as there are from moving away from US or global standards. So I think with all of this, there are trade-offs, and I think we have to acknowledge that. I'll give you an example. If there was, and there isn't, this is hypothetical, kind of straight choice between getting rid of GDPR, which I think is pretty bad regulation, or but in the process would also have to get rid of data adequacy agreement with the EU. I think if you asked entrepreneurs, and I'm pretty sure, I know if you asked entrepreneurs, they would rather put up with GDPR and all of those annoying things then cut the flow of data between the UK and EU because it's in their business interest to do so. So these aren't simple matters of looking at bad regulations and saying we need to just scrap them entirely. And not everything can be blamed on the EU, as Victoria was talking about. So consider the online harms bill proposals. So these require companies to prevent illegal content and activity online and ensure children are not exposed to harmful content, which I think we can all agree are good things. But many campaigners around it don't think they'll be effective. And the damage to tech startups is going to be really significant, with sanctions for non-compliance being as high as 18 million or 10% of global turnover. Kind of more worrying around tech startups for tech startup investors that we talk to all the time is the plans to lower the burden of proof needed from the CMA to block mergers or acquisitions involving large tech companies that are deemed to have strategic market status. So many don't like this, but the reality is a lot of people starting companies see kind of a sale to a large tech company as the reason for starting the business, and investors certainly the reason for backing that business. So consider someone like Alice Chesterman, who's one of our greatest entrepreneurs. In 2001, he started Love Film, which used to send kind of DVDs to people before the internet kind of took off. And he sold it to Amazon in 2011. But that was just the start of his journey. He's since founded $2 billion companies, Zoopla and Kazoo. But how different would his story have been if he hadn't had the opportunity to exit to Amazon back in 2011? So on this issue, when polled by Kodak, who represent kind of small startups, a lobby group, half of UK investors said they would significantly curb the amount invested in these if these come to force. So if we crack down on M&A activity, we will have a lot fewer tech startups, at least in the UK. And I'll briefly mention the housing shortage, something that has been talked about a lot at the conference. We have a shortage of houses in places where people want to live. It's perhaps the most egregious kind of regulatory issue out there, but you can see the party kind of backing down on this issue as we speak. And it's not got anything to do with the EU. We need more homes and offices and spaces where there are entrepreneurial hubs, like Manchester, like London, like Cambridge, where agglomeration drives innovation. But planning regulations are pricing people out and companies out, and we can't see kind of the untold damage that we're doing there. But I've been negative enough, let's be optimistic. So there are important ways where we can diverge from the EU. And it's being driven by innovators, many of whom are already in the UK, and many of whom could be attracted with the right regulatory framework. So the work of TIGA and the Regulatory Horizons Council, I think, is absolutely critical here. So consider the recent success on gene-edited crops. Recommendations were made by TIGA, then by the Regulatory Horizons Councils in reports this year, and already there are now recommendations, even though they stop short of allowing products straight onto supermarket shelves or in gene-edited livestock, the requirements around commercialization of this will be eased. And just to point out, in case you're wondering, gene editing isn't gene modification like the GM stuff. It's literally something that occurs naturally in nature, so it's absolutely nothing to worry about. Not exactly the GM is anything to worry about either, but it's even less to worry about if you're that way minded. So in the US, we've already seen innovations around soybean oil, like tomatoes that have higher amino acids and such. And this is one area of many where the UK could dominate. So we could see this also, these sorts of radical interventions in kind of regulation in anything from drones to autonomous vehicles to cannabinoid clinical research, lab-grown meat. And if you read TIGA's 130-page report, it's a testament to what we can achieve. And a lot of the stuff in there isn't necessarily related to the EU, but it's a real kind of what you should do if you really want to kind of solve issues with the regulatory state. But there is one thing I'm less optimistic to, and I hope optimistic about. Hopefully this kind of starts a bit of discussion. So the TIGA's call for the kind of 1 in, 2 out idea. So in the past, the numbers were fudged on this. So we had this under coalition, we've had this under previous governments. So National Audit Office report looked at kind of their ambition to reduce regulatory costs by 10 billion. At the time, this wasn't all the way through the Parliament, they'd only reduced it by 0.9 by their own estimates, but the NAO suggested it was 8.3 billion had been actually added. So the risk of that is that you just take things out and say, this is too important to be added to this list, and we've actually ended up with more regulation. Of course, some of this is probably necessary, but not all of it. And if you're going to say you're reducing regulation by 10 billion, you should probably do it, or at least aim to do it. So in conclusion, I'm very positive about kind of new innovation and all the stuff that George has been doing. I think that's absolutely great. but I'm kind of a bit more pessimistic about some of the entrenched regulation and also these kind of new regulations that are happening in tech that seem mostly unnecessary, or at least too costly to solve the problem in the way they're trying to solve it. So, thank you.
Thanks, Philip. Minister, we're delighted to have you here. Thanks for joining us. What do you think our approach to regulation should look like?
Thanks, Ruth. It's great to be back. And thank you to the IEA for convening this, because to me this is one of the most important conversations as we gather at this conference. And let me say why. We face, as a result of COVID, debt to GDP ratios on a level, I mean, we haven't seen for, I think it's the worst level since about 1760. This is a really serious crisis. We're carrying a ton of debt, and we've got to get out of debt for the next generation because of the risk of interest rate rises. And how are we going to do that? And I want to suggest to you, and I say this as somebody who came to Parliament in 2010 after a 15-year career financing, starting and founding companies that weren't growing like the British economy at 1% or 2% or 3%. They were growing at 100% a year, 200% a year. Sectors growing at 300% a year. That's how we're going to grow our way out. And so if the fire alarm goes in 30 seconds, the key for this country now, having been through the agony of the Brexit stalemate and all the political horror shows and the horror show of COVID, we have, because of the vaccine, I'll come back to regulation and vaccine in a minute, because of the vaccine, we have about an 18-month head start in the global race for growth. There is a wall of money internationally looking for a safe place to invest in the big technologies that will really transform the economies of the world and deliver that 100, 200, 300% growth. We're sitting on those technologies here, and there's a huge opportunity outside of the EU regulatory framework for us to deliver that growth. But it's not, I want to suggest, and I agree, Victoria, with a lot of your analysis. A lot of the problem is in Whitehall, actually, as much as it is in Europe. We've been gold-plating EU rules for years. Most departments I've worked in tend to be 95% of them think they're there to write policy. There should be 10% policy, 90% implementation. And, we have immensely good regulators. I would suggest the MHRA are largely responsible for the fact that we've got an 18-month head start in the global race for growth. Some of them are woeful. So a lot of the problem, I just think over-blaming Europe for our own failures in this country is to misanalyse the problem. The good news is ministers are sovereign. We've taken back control. We do now have a proper sovereign parliament, and we have a chance to get it right. But if you get the analysis wrong, I fear we get the prescription wrong. And my argument is that we have a chance now to not terrify businesses that came to this country because we're the gateway into the European market. So convergence in the big sectors that are here, so they're not saying in the boardrooms we need to pull out of the UK. And divergence, gradually, where Europe is slow, and leadership in the new sectors that technology is driving. And when the PM rang me at Christmas and said, look, would you do a big piece of work for me? For 5 years after Brexit, believe it or not, no one has defined the regulatory opportunity. Bluntly, Brexiteers have sort of airily asserted it'll all happen magically on day one, and the Brexit skeptics have said there isn't one unless you put children back up chimneys. Both wrong. There is a huge opportunity, and you may be surprised. I mean, I was a Remain campaigner in the referendum because as Minister for the Life Science sector, a £60 billion, 250,000 people employing sector that is the jewel in the crown of our economy. You couldn't find a man or woman in that sector who wanted to leave, and I felt I had a duty to speak for them. But the British people are sovereign. We've left the EU. We need to use the freedoms that we now have properly to defy the Brexit skeptics and show that we're going to build an incredible engine of innovative growth and spread it around the country, not just in Cambridge and London and Oxford. So I think it's a huge opportunity. Let me describe, firstly, what the Tigger report really says. Secondly, what, in this new role as Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation, I'm going to try and do to implement it. And just thirdly, to flag the key oil of this is enterprise and the spirit of entrepreneurship and enterprise, which is vital. You can have all the regulatory frameworks you want, but to coin the Prime Minister's phrase, if the animal spirits of the entrepreneurs of this country aren't set alight, then they'll never use the regulatory framework. And that I think, is a slightly different point and a really important one. So Tigger, bluntly, do have a look at it, if you just Google Tigger, you'll get to gov.uk and see the report. By the way, the officials wanted to call it the Regulatory Opportunities Task Force, which I haven't learned much in government, but after about 3 nanoseconds worked out would transcribe to rot. And I suggested, why don't we call it the Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform and put a bit of Tigger in the tank? So that's how it came to be called TIGA. It sets out three things. Firstly, a really bold new framework in which we argue that there's no point leaving the EU and then following. If we're going to leave, we need to lead, and we need to really elevate regulation from being a incredibly bureaucratic tick box compliance, high-vis jacket drag on everybody's lives. I mean, who wants to be a regulator in an environment like that? I mean, it's like being a traffic warden of the economy, keep putting tickets on everything and stopping everyone. Let's grip regulation and the freedoms so that we can lead in the smart, digital, entrepreneurial, innovative regulation for tomorrow's economy. Let's fundamentally change the way our regulators work. First thing I suggest the PM does is get them all into number 10. Find out who these people are. Stop them hiding behind, I mean, everyone knows June Rain and the MHRA. She's a hero. The MHRA have delivered the vaccine for us. That's the gold standard. And we want all our regulators at that level working with industry. So the first thing sets out a really bold framework, and in which Ian Duncan-Smith and Teresa Villiers and I recommend that we drop the EU's precautionary principle and replace it with a much more British principle of proportionality. It is ridiculous that the Lower Piddlington Table Tennis Club can't send their membership to their own treasurer because of GDPR risks, when the big tech companies just don't even blink. I mean, the whole point about the British canon, the canon of common law, Scottish common law and English, is that it's proportionate. And proportionality should mean that the Table Tennis Club don't have to worry about GDPR. The big tech companies do. And that's how it should be. But they shouldn't be wrapped up in red tape or compliance. The principles should be set out. We want a digital economy, but we do not want you abusing your power and abusing the rights of citizens and of patients and of the public. That's a very British, dare I say, a very conservative idea. So the first bit sets out a profound change in the way we view regulation. The second section, because that's all quite ethereal, I wanted to make sure that it was very practical. We set out 10 sectors, Prime Minister, where you don't need to pass primary legislation. You could now make the changes to unleash really significant growth. And they are fintech, scale-up finance. Basically, the pension funds here are investing half what the Americans are in private in equities, and half of that in private. But we're never going to build an innovation economy because we bolted the door after the crash and after the horse had bolted. We're now tying our great city of London up. They can't invest in our own companies. Thirdly, data, and we called for eventually the replacement of the GDPR with a better system, not the abolition on day one, because in the end, you're right, Philip, it actually provides a single market for digital goods. But what we think we can do is to gradually create a UK regime that other countries might sign up to that sets a much stronger framework for the next 20, 30 years of AI and digital economy. Clinical trials, massive opportunity for us after COVID, digital health, agri-environment. If we're not careful, we're going to tie our farmers up in even worse red tape. And the whole point of leaving the CAP was that we could actually design here a British model of agri-environment where we reward farmers for the things we all value properly, and we measure them. And instead of 20 visits from teenagers in high-vis jackets filling in forms, farmers didn't go into farming to fill in forms. We should go once a year and say, how are you getting on? Good. Your water's clean, your hedges are growing, the butterflies are flourishing, you're doing really well, here's the money. And we should create actually a market, dare I say, a conservative market. Investors, there are investors around the world investing in biodiversity net gain credits. There's a market here. And if we just hand it over to Natural England to do it via the old model, we'll end up tying another generation of farmers in red tape. Clean energy, nutraceuticals, transport technology, and I think I've missed one, but anyway, there are 10 sectors. There's 100 sectors out there. The PM said, that was brilliant. Can you do another one? And another one. And all we did was 75 industry roundtables on Zoom. Best benefit of Zoom, you can actually get people around a table really quick, really fast, and asked very specifically, what are the things you need us to do to unleash the growth? And that's what the report says. And the third bit is about how you implement. And ultimately, to avoid this becoming just another report that gathers dust, my argument is we should require every department to be scored by the Treasury, which makes people sit up, on some very simple metrics, not have you got a strategy on deregulation? How much inward investment has your department pulled in? How many businesses? We can debate what those metrics are, but believe me as a minister, it's very, very easy for the machine to ignore political initiatives unless and until you get to the Treasury reporting point. Minister, I'm afraid we've got to submit our report to the Treasury on how we're doing on implementing the new regulatory program, and we're in the red zone. That's when the minds get focused. Why are we in the red zone? Well, because and there's a whole bunch of things. And I think if we annually do that and drive it through, then in the end, you've got to change the culture. So last 2 points. As Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation, the PM has now given me the brief to help drive that through government. And my first mission is to make sure that the science superpower is actually a finely tuned Formula One engine. We're going to tip a lot of money in. Boy, do people struggling to pay the bills need to know that every pound is going to be efficiently used to create the new sectors, the technologies, the clusters of tomorrow. They're going around the country, and the innovation nation, so that we unleash, not just in the Golden Triangle, but around the country, those new sectors. And my last point is enterprise, which is slightly different from innovation. It's the fuel, and we need a generation of people. People do deals with people. People hire people. People build companies. People take risks. People make stuff happen. And we need to inspire a new generation of, they can be older entrepreneurs, they don't have to be young, but a new generation. I'm old enough, this is my 30th party conference. And, you know, the Thatcher generation in 6 years did some transformational stuff. You know, I drive back from Norfolk every weekend and I see the City of London through my car window as I come through on the M11. It didn't exist in 1981 or 2. I mean, it was built really fast because we created a framework through the regeneration corporations. I think we need to do some really big stuff, and we've got the pace of technology, here's the good news, is creating incredible market opportunities for us. And we're very dynamic, agile, and fleet of foot. We need to inspire and demand that our regulators step up to the plate and lead in innovative regulation. We shouldn't be talking about e-scooters for 7 years. They'll have gone out of fashion by the time Parliament issues a report. We should create 5 test beds for e-scooters. We should have done it last year. Data, GPS trackers on all of them, collect the data and regulate on the basis of data. And if they're lethal in London and safe everywhere around the country, fine, regulated on that basis, done. And if we create those frameworks, we'll build investor confidence. You've got to go to the UK. They've got the smartest agile regulatory framework. That's where you get the data that shows that your drone, your autonomous vehicle, your satellite system works. They put the Union Jack on it. They're setting the global standards. And then you export it internationally. Get it right, bless you. There's a huge opportunity for us, and time is ticking. Yeah, we've got to grip it now. We can't be sitting here in 7 years talking about this. We're up against some phenomenal other countries who do have industrial strategies, and not having one is a strategy, and I think it's a really bad one. I think we should be laying the foundations for backing British ingenuity, leadership, and enterprise, so that we can seize this moment and inspire a bunch of people who didn't vote for it that actually this is the Conservative Party doing something phenomenal to create hope and opportunity for a new generation.
Thank you. It's interesting that what everyone has focused on there has been very formal regulation. And there's obviously lots of other ways that businesses are regulated in an informal manner through things like the media, reputation, and that sort of thing. And I think I'd be quite interested to hear a little bit about what the panel see as those mechanisms and how that balance is and whether we've got that quite right as well at the moment. Sarah, you obviously represent a lot of companies where reputation is very important. So do you maybe want to come in on that first?
Sure. It's funny, as you were saying that, I was reflecting that one of the issues I had when I was a regulator, when I worked for the regulator in the central bank, is that the media and generally the public at large never accept any level of failure in financial services. And let's be honest, sometimes firms will fail, sometimes things will go wrong, and trying to prop up old systems doesn't always mean that we then actually have the best innovation. So I think there is a difficulty, particularly on the reputational side with the media, that if you are not going to accept failure, then you're going to find it very difficult to innovate, because people, if you try and try and try, sometimes you will fail and sometimes you will succeed. And I think we just need to be more honest about that. There are safety mechanisms in place, particularly in financial services. That's why we have the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. That's why we have capital levels for banks. That's why we have those protections. But fundamentally, if the regulators are constantly under a trial by media, if our sectors are under a trial by media, then it is going to stifle innovation. And I think I don't know the answer to how to fix that, so if somebody else in the panel can jump in and come up with an answer, that would be great. But I do think that that is definitely something that everyone needs to think about.
Victoria, the role of failure?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think especially in financial services, as Sarah says, it's because it's so high profile, and a big failure of a financial institution has very significant real life effects, often for consumers or even more widely throughout the financial system. So obviously these things do attract a high profile, and financial services is one of these areas where the regulatory system has become so overbearing and prescriptive, especially in terms of conduct regulation. And I'm thinking of things like the requirements to carry out affordability assessments and all of these regulations around fairness, treating customers fairly. That is really very difficult for firms to innovate on devising new products or how they market to different sections of the market, especially less affluent consumers become frozen out of lots of financial products because it's simply not worth the risk to the provider of making them a loan or advising them, for example, financial advice services. It's almost impossible for less affluent consumers to get financial advice on their pensions and investments because it's simply not worth the risk to the provider. And that's because of all of the conduct regulation. And as I wrote about earlier this year about the role of the Financial Ombudsman Service, and all of this, I mentioned before, this idea of learned helplessness, it just actually takes away the consumer's, it takes away the expectation that a consumer is capable of finding out about products themselves, reading the terms and conditions, and deciding for themselves, perhaps with some advice, what's the best option for them. And once you take those factors out of a market, you don't really have a market at all, and it's very difficult for these providers to innovate. And the same goes really across the board in lots of different sectors. The energy markets now have fairness requirements in the regulatory code that Ofgem is responsible for, and so how energy companies can market the kinds of sophisticated, different kinds of ways of providing energy that the net zero target will require. That's going to be very difficult to do if we're going to be importing the same prescriptive levels of regulation on how providers can interact with their customers. It stifles innovation, and it's ultimately very bad for consumers. And the real thing that should be keeping businesses honest and preventing abusive or exploitative behaviour and the provision of unreliable, poor quality products and services and poor customer service is competition. It's forces of competition that make businesses provide good products and services that consumers actually want. Having black letter regulations telling businesses what to do and how to do it is not the best way of enhancing consumer welfare, and it actively acts against innovation.
George, what do you think about the way that formal regulation potentially is crowding out informal ways of moderating behaviour?
I think it's a very interesting observation, and as you were talking, I've got 4 answers to it. Firstly, I think it's political. I think we need to. It's why we're in politics. It's why ministers are here. We need to make very clear, what the success metric is. And if you think back to the Thatcher generation, it was really clear. The whole country got it. Mrs. T didn't say, I'm going to create a utility company that is just, I'm going to substantially shift a very large chunk of what we currently do through government into the private sector and give you all a chance to benefit. And it's the same now. It's a different challenge in some ways not. But I think it's about political leadership. And if we do government by Instagram and little announcements and little 10 millions here's, you incubate a dependency culture, which is exactly what Victoria's talking about. And I think that's one of the geniuses of of Boris is he's not a technocrat. He's painting a big, inspiring canvas of where we can get to and leaving ministers like me to do the detail. The public, that's really important because it sets the metric of success. Secondly, Whitehall. I mean, Whitehall is, it is incredibly risk averse. It is, partly it's trying to defend ministers from embarrassing failures. Well, if ministers aren't big enough to cope with saying that didn't work, then they shouldn't be ministers. And the honesty to be able to say, listen, in COVID, we got some things magnificently right, we got some things wrong. And we're not going to duck those issues, but in the middle of fighting the pandemic isn't the time to be talking about our failures. We didn't discuss in the middle of the Battle of Britain why the big wing wasn't working very well. But afterwards we did, and we learnt those lessons and applied them in North Africa. So, it's about a culture of clarity of what it is we really want to achieve. I think one of the problems in Whitehall is, to me, as you go through the civil service, we should insist when you get to whatever grade it is that you're working, you have a 3-6 month secondment in the business sector that you're legislating for. And I think everyone would learn a huge amount and come back and understand the dangers of the machine that is legislating. Thirdly, the truth is, in government, we often reward failure. I mean, in the health service, I used to be a health minister. I went to Salford Hospital. And if you deliver in the public services more for less, which is what we all want, right? We tend to go, okay, we gave you too much money last time, we'll give you less. I mean, we literally reward failure. Every CSR, every month. I mean, it's extraordinary that there's any innovation in the public services. I mean, just quite extraordinary. So I do think the way we reward, the way we fund, needs to be much more driven by success. And in my role on science, I'm going to be highlighting to all the research councils, this is what success looks like. It's world-class science winning patents, papers, Nobel Prizes, or it's industrial science that's pulling in huge investment. But we're not funding a huge engine of mediocrity. And I think being clear about what the metrics are. And then lastly, markets. I mean, we privatised the telecoms market in the 80s. And I think, to be honest, in quite a lot of the utilities, we've slightly lazily allowed some big monopolies to sit, making quite a lot of money off consumers without enough dynamism and competition. I mean, the principles of privatisation were private capital, markets and competition, and innovation. I don't think BT have shown enough of that over the last 30 years. We gave them a golden opportunity to shape the global telecoms revolution. In the energy sector, we've ended up with utility companies that are, I think, sitting in quite a lazy position. So I think some of it is about using regulation to create markets. And in my work, I'm not looking to pick winners in terms of individual companies because they happen to be in Teesside, but selecting sectors where we actually have got a global advantage and other countries are investing, and if we don't, we'll fall behind. And if one company fails, I don't care at all, as long as we're building clusters of success and everyone has an opportunity. And I think in the end it comes from the top, Victoria, and it's about defining success in the right way.
Philip, do you want to come in on the points there around culture and in terms of the regulatory framework, both formal and informal, what it is that's actually inspiring people?
Yeah, I mean, obviously everyone looks at Silicon Valley as a kind of culture of where failure is accepted, and I think it can be a little bit kind of masochistic to kind of focus on them too much, because even in the US, other states are also focusing on them, so they're kind of in a kind of unique outlier. And actually, the UK is a lot better than most of Europe, for example, on these things. So when they do kind of surveys of entrepreneurial intention or ambition, or kind of like views on failure, then the UK are kind of sit in between the Atlantic, between the US and the rest of Europe. So I think we're pretty well placed in the world for those sorts of things. In terms of the way that kind of connects into regulation, I think it can be really important. So one example would be the FCA sandbox, which I'm sure there's other people kind of more qualified to talk about this on the panel. But that's been an area which has been hugely successful. I remember talking to one of the two kind of big crowdfunding platforms, and I was like, why aren't you going over to the US? Obviously, the US market must be much bigger. The fear there was literally being prosecuted, but also just they're not being welcomed over there as well. So a lot of these ideas around regulation is just getting rid of regulation. I think I agree with George's point about creating markets and creating situations where the regulators themselves can be really open to ideas. I mean, talking to entrepreneurs who deal with the sandbox, they can literally send an email or pick up the phone call and just say, look, I don't really understand this. Am I going to be in trouble if I do this particular thing? And the people that they staff there, at least kind of when I was talking to the entrepreneurs about it, they would answer them and be very straight with them and give them that kind of freedom in which to fail, to make mistakes, and not with the threat of ending up in jail or a criminal record on the back of it. So I think that's really important. One idea I quite like, which sadly I didn't come up with, but I think it was John Fingleton originally, was this kind of N+1 regulator, and the idea behind this is that with all this kind of emerging technology we've kind of talked about, it might be that your regulator isn't really up to the task of regulating you because they're so used to dealing with incumbents, and therefore they're just not responding to anything you want. The idea of this regulator was sit kind of separate to the other regulators, and you can say, look, I'm so innovative that I really don't want to be regulated by the Department for Transport or whoever it is that's not doing the proper job, and I'm going to disrupt all the incumbents, and they're kind of lobbying effectively against me. So you're in your role. Please look at this as a special case, and I think there's a strong argument for that, because as good as the regulators are, they're not always going to be up to scratch. They're not always going to be as good as kind of FCA when it comes to the sandbox work. So I think there's a lot of work still that needs to be done in getting the kind of structure right of regulators so that they don't kind of fail in the way they failed so much. But
I was just going to say, I am a bit of a sandbox skeptic in the sense that I do accept that they do yield some good success stories. But for me, relying on sandbox schemes, which for people who don't know that particular jargon, it's a sort of controlled conditions project where a business with a new-ish idea that they don't perhaps fully understand how it would fit within an existing regulatory structure can work together with the regulators sort of in a supervised project to trial it and see how it would work out without facing liabilities if it transpires that perhaps the regulator might have considered it was not compliant, if that's a rather rambling explanation. But my problem with the use of sandboxes is that that's an admission that the basic default regulatory structure is oppressive to innovation and unhelpful to startups. So for me, if we are going around asking for lots more sandboxes in lots more regulated sectors, surely that's an admission that the regulations as they stand as a default for most businesses are not really working very well. And rather than put these patches in, shouldn't we be focusing on the structural issue that applies as a default? Because how many entrepreneurs and startups don't get into a sandbox because they don't know how to go about it, or they're not accepted onto the scheme? So how much innovation are we losing because we are essentially limiting the opportunities for innovation to a select group who manage to apply for and accepted into a sandbox scheme? Shouldn't we be attending to the bigger problem of the default regime?
We have to do both. Nobody's suggesting that sandboxes are, you can have a really bad regulatory system, but it's okay because you've got a few sandboxes. No one's suggesting that. Well, you look sceptical, but I can tell you, I'm talking to innovative companies all day, and they're telling me, and they're very clear. I mean, take autonomous vehicles. Right? It's not sensible, legitimate, reasonable, safe, or in any way wise to just let autonomous vehicles loose on the motorway. But if we want to be a leader in this incredible technology, we need to create some places where you can begin to test them in real markets. So to say that is not to say, Victoria, that we shouldn't be regulating more broadly for innovation enterprise. But the pace of technology coming is creating incredible opportunities. We've got to move fast. And you can't regulate for the whole country fast in emerging technologies. You need to create places where you can quickly test them. And so if I was suggesting that these were, an excuse for sloppy and lazy regulation everywhere, then I completely put my hands up and say guilty as charged. But they're not. And one of the problems with Whitehall is it tends to use the everywhere must get everything at the same time argument to be very slow. And actually, if we create some places that are test beds, it'll drive levelling up as well. I'd like to, Teesside is becoming a test bed for hydrogen technology. Here. Cornwall and Scotland are about to become test beds for our small payload satellite launch capability. Here. And honestly, if you really want to build a growing economy, in the pace of technology that's with us, we're going to have to create a regulatory environment that is agile, fast, digital, and doesn't wait for an act of parliament. And that's what the testbed revolution is really about.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, George. And I think you're right, there is definitely a place for both. And just from my experience when I was at the FCA observing the sandboxes, one of the benefits I think of sandboxes which we haven't discussed is the challenge that it gives to the regulator. So it's not just about providing an environment where people can try different things and learn. It's also the regulator seeing how businesses are evolving and working out how actually they need to be more agile and how they need to change what they're doing to allow these businesses to flourish. I mean, my big bugbear when I was at the regulator was that I just didn't think the sandboxes were ambitious enough. It was a small cohort, sometimes 15, 20 firms, and we were completely oversubscribed. I think actually we need to be doing more in that space to learn from the ideas that are coming up.
Right, let's open this up to the floor. Who's got questions? Oh, lots. Okay, let's take this one in the middle here. And if you can first, and if you can say who you are and where you're from, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Gwen and I work at Green Alliance, which is an environmental think tank. So the framing in this discussion around regulation as a sort of burden for business, rather than necessarily seeing it as an important tool which can sort of deliver on our public policy objectives. So I'd really like to know from the panel how you see the role of regulation in delivering on our net zero target and also creating a better environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll take a couple more as well in a group. So maybe front row over here.
Yes, hi, I'm James Crisp. I'm from The Telegraph. I'm afraid I have two questions. The first one is for Mr. Freeman, and it's about the Tigger report. Can you tell us what parts of the Tigger report can't apply to Northern Ireland because of the Northern Ireland Protocol? And for the whole panel, I'd like to hear what you guys think is the best piece of EU regulation. Thank you.
One final one. Yeah, another one in the front row.
Hi, thanks. My name's Kate Young. I'm from the Aldersgate Group, which is a cross-economy business membership organisation. My question can be grouped in on net zero. Most of our businesses would say that because net zero is going to require such a fundamental transformation of their business models, that they need regulation to provide a long-term sense of direction and certainty so that they can invest. And there's plenty of evidence that suggests well-designed regulation can provide significant economic benefits. So I just wondered what you'd have to say in response to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Great questions. Let's go to Philip first.
So on the net zero, I'm kind of taking an economist view that we should have something like a border-adjusted carbon tax and then let it filter through the economy. So the idea here is that carbon is taxed, and therefore we're not saying you need to invest in this particular type of technology, you need to invest in that particular type of technology, and then the solutions come from the private sector as it kind of filters down. The border-adjusted aspect of it means that we're just not importing carbon from other countries and losing our industries at the same time. It's a difficult thing to do. The EU's looking at doing it. I think Austria's done something unilaterally the other day, which I haven't looked at in detail yet, but I think it's the future. The US is also looking at doing it, and I think that's what's going to happen. And I think that's the best solution to that. That said, there probably are arguments for kind of prizes and competitions for solving particular problems. I'm quite a big fan of those. I think historically they've worked quite well in terms of longitude prize and all these kind of exciting X prizes and things like that. On the best EU side of things, I'd say anything to do with state aid rules are positive, and I think that's the threat, I suppose, of leaving the EU, that we just end up subsidising our own industries, and I think that's a bad ending if we end up doing that. I think most people that kind of believe in economic freedom would agree with that and would think that was probably one of the better parts of being part of the EU.
Great. Victoria?
Yeah, I think on the net zero, I broadly agree with Philip that if we must pursue a rather, in my view, arbitrary and ill-advised net zero target, then I would much rather we did it in a free market way rather than directing or trying to direct technological development with subsidies and particular plans, mainly because I don't think that will work very well. It gets back to George's point before about picking winners. I think the best way to encourage green technology and innovation is the same really for any technology and innovation, which is to have a general ecosystem that supports innovativeness and innovative people and businesses with things like an insolvency regime that doesn't unduly punish failure, which is really important, intellectual property rules, low tax that supports innovation and corporate growth rather than punishes it. And in terms of my favourite EU rules, I would probably go right back to founding principles actually, and the idea of zero tariffs and mutual recognition on regulation. And I think the mutual recognition of regulations is a real Brexit opportunity that we should be pursuing, irrespective of whether it's reciprocated to us by the EU. As it happens, that would also be extremely helpful for the Irish border question, but also for the UK's position in global trade. If we could recognise the goods regulations and indeed the services regulations, financial services mutual recognition regimes are also really important. And I've said mutual, but I actually don't even think they need to be mutual. I think the UK should recognise appropriate regulations of any country in order to support consumers buying the best goods and services from wherever they are produced in the world.
Great. Let's go George and then Sarah.
Great questions. The net zero one is huge, and I actually think this is probably going to be the dividing line, one of the dividing lines of the next election, because I hear Ed Miliband. I don't know if you heard him on Newsnight the other day. I mean, full kind of burger flow, that net zero is the shining legitimization of nationalisation. He couldn't have been clearer. Net zero will demand that we pull the levers of the economy to deliver net growth, so we're going to nationalise. I mean, our approach couldn't be more different, which is, no, we're going to harness the genius of the market, and that requires us, I would suggest, to set the right regulatory framework. We just need to create the market conditions in which enlightened consumers can pick up a product and choose and go, well, that one's got a lower carbon footprint than that one. And so clear labelling, clear metrics, unleash the power of the market. I'm absolutely optimistic that that'll deliver net zero far quicker than letting Ed Miliband pull the levers of the economy. And I'll give you a specific example. Agri-environment. I come from a farming background. I led the agri-tech strategy. We've cleaned up the energy sector very expensively. Consumers are paying a lot of money for that. The next two dirty industries on the block are agriculture and transport. I was Minister for Decarbonisation of Transport and launched the agri-tech strategy. Why is agriculture so bad? Well, firstly, globally, we're cultivating huge amounts of rainforest and releasing a lot of carbon. But in our own system, the post-war model of agriculture, very chemical farming, very intense chemical application, fertilizers, chemical, hugely carbon intensive. So the challenge is, can we create a 21st century agriculture that is much lower carbon intensive? The answer is absolutely we can. And guess what? UK agriculture is pioneering a completely different model. It's minimal cultivation, gene-edited disease-resistant crops. The disease-resistant potato generated, I'm proud to say, in Norfolk. The Prime Minister mentioned it on his first day on the steps of number 10. Why is this significant? Because the potato plant that we all rely on for fish and chips and at the moment requires 14 applications of a pretty toxic and highly carbon-intensive fungicide. The blight-resistant potato, a naturally occurring blight-resistant gene in a wild strain potato plant, means you don't have to do it. Amazing. That's how we're going to reduce the carbon footprint of agriculture, and using satellites to make sure we only spray in the bit of the field that's got the disease. And it's an incredible revolution, agri-tech, and we lead in it. And it'll be harnessing the genius of the market and innovation, as well as, I think, people's instincts to live a healthier life. Most people, if they could, they often can't, would love to walk a bit more each day, would love to walk the kids to school, would love to just breathe a bit of fresh air. We make it quite difficult. We've got a very 1950s model of everyone must get in a car and be a slave to congestion and pollution. And actually, I think most people want to live a healthier life. On the very good question about Tigger, you'll have to ask Lord Frost, who now leads on the implementation of Tigger and is leading on the very difficult Northern Ireland negotiations, and they are at a very sensitive stage. The EU regs, I'd give you three. I thought the creation of the single market was a pretty big idea, actually. I was with it until they started to superimpose on top of it a whole bunch of political and all the social chapter regulations. But the idea of a single market to drive post-war prosperity in this key part of the world, I thought was a really bold regulatory move. That's why Mrs. T supported it. I think the state aid rules were and remain important. And actually, if you want me to be more specific, I think the Clean Air Directive, actually, just highlighting, guys, 350,000 people in this country die prematurely because of disease from dirty air outside school gates. We're giving our kids hugely dirty air to breathe. Find your own way to fix it, but fix it we must. I don't have a problem with that. The key is that we harness markets to deliver the progress and don't let Ed Miliband loose on the economy.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up there because we're over time, but thank you to all of our panellists, some really practical ideas there.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.